Myths of the Machine is brought to you by our sponsor, Mighty Man Limited. Be a master of the universe when you wear Mighty Man Limited athletic and sportswear, custom-designed athletic compression gear for male and female athletes, compression shirts, sports bras, yoga pants, hoodies, and more. Available only at mightyman.logosoftware.com. Be mighty. Since the time when men gathered around campfires and told tales of the warriors who challenged the monsters that gather in the dark. The mighty men who fought alongside the gods, some rising to victory, others falling into the abyss. These are the heroes who became the myths of the machine. It was 2 months that I lived under the ocean's waves. It had been 2 months since the night of the storm when I was dragged into the cold Atlantic Ocean by strange creatures who spent their entire lives under the sea. 2 months since I learned I was something other than a normal human, when I realized I was able to breathe underwater just as easily as I could walking down Broadway. The creatures weren't creatures at all. Without their sea-designed pressure suits, they required to travel in the regions above the ocean floors they called home. They looked like normal people. They called themselves the Mera-Bello, the Sea Warriors. It was hard to follow along with their stories, as I was still learning their language, which sounded quite different than when I had first encountered the Mera-Bello in their pressure suits on that night that seemed so long ago. It was only 8 or 9 weeks, as I could determine. The Mera-Bello didn't sleep or eat on the same patterns that we did, so it was hard to keep track of time. This was the first time I was allowed to see the surface, but still nowhere near dry land. We sat on watercraft they called pikes. Mera-Bello built devices that could ride like motorcycles. They were powered by some sort of magnetic flux systems, as one of the many tutors they provided had instructed me. The underwater society had sciences and technology far different than our own on the surface. During my lessons, I was also told the Mera-Bello were but one of many intelligent human or humanoid people who lived under the sea. The Mera-Bello insisted they were engineered by the same spacefaring travelers who designed those of us who lived on the dry land. It sounded like the same crazy story the guy with the wild hair was always talking about on that cable show, Ancient Aryans. I told them that science now proved that humans had evolved from apes in Africa, and the group of water-breathing instructors looked at each other and laughed. If I understood correctly, I was told we who live on the dry land had forgotten almost everything and replaced it with urchin vomit. After the events of the last 2 months, I really didn't know what to believe. We sat on the pikes about half a mile from an Olivia Petroleum sea rig as another nation of underwater people attacked it with a violent fury. They were called the Limpet, and they had traveled from the middle of the Pacific Ocean to launch their assault on the Fleischer Conglomerate's energy resource division, Olivia Petro. The Limpet were the blood enemies of the Mera-Bello, and this attack on the surface resource was meant to provoke a retaliatory rage upon the local ocean people by the surface folk, whom my hosts insisted were well aware of their existence. I told them if anybody on the surface knew that these underwater races existed, it would be headline news. Again, they laughed at me. "In our world," said one Mera-Bello, "the lamprey does not steer the shark." Naturally, I had no idea what he was talking about. The Limpet assault had crushed the bulk of the Petro rig workers, and now only 2 of them remained to defend the deep-sea drilling station. The Mera-Bello had optic enhancements built into their pressure suits, but I wasn't wearing one. For some reason, I didn't need it. I could travel to the ocean floor or any depth above our heads. The same tutor who remarked about the sharks and lamprey made a snide comment. I recognized only one simple word: mutant, and, of course, the look on his sneering face. I was handed what I can only call a pair of binoculars. As I raised the black shell-looking thing to my eyes, I was caught unaware as 2 pink, slimy tentacles shot out of the shell and attached itself to my face. "Ah!" Get it off! Relax, said the scout Byrne, on the pike closest to mine, as he placed his armored hand on my bare shoulder. It will make you see better. He steadied the shell slug device, allowing me to readjust my grip and my stomach as I allowed the gooey tentacles to envelop my face. On the top of the shell, small tentacle antennae reached up to the sky, leaving their protected armor to probe the air around it. They focused on the battle in the distance. I could see and hear everything in amazing detail. The two remaining rig workers fought like berserkers. The two were definitely mismatched in appearance. One tall and overweight with a shaggy head of hair and a beard to match. The other, smaller in stature and clean-shaved, both swinging muscular tattooed arms and rocky fists into the Lampette's armored marauders. It was obvious the two had worked side by side for many years, as their motions were coordinated with each other, creating a cyclone of destructive motion around them. Smashed pressure suits spurted water after the bald sailor's fist crashed into one, then another. The larger man must have had incredible strength as I watched him lift and hurl huge steel oil drums at the Lampette forces, crushing those who it impacted against, scattering those it did not. Unbelievably, it looked as though the two surface dwellers would push back the Lampette. Wait, surface dwellers? What was I thinking? These were people. These were my people, not surface dwellers. Apparently I was learning some of the Mera-Bello's lessons, but in a strange manner. Driven to the rampart of the oil rig by the savage defense from the two superhuman dynamos, the Lampette began to build a larger unit out of the individual weapons they each carried. Their smaller rifles, for lack of a better term, amalgamated into a single, man-sized weapon. Burns said, "They will feel Poseidon's thrum." I can only presume he meant the Lampette's supergun that was now being aimed at the secure position the merchant sailors had taken. Even from this distance, I could hear the awful bellow of the Lampette's weapon as it fired on the defenseless men. Only sound was discharged from the Lampette supergun, but its destructive energy tore through the steel superstructure, sending metal shards everywhere. The two sailors were exposed, their protective cover now gone, and the Lampette weapon fired again. The energy tore the steel deck plates apart, leaving deadly gaps at the sailors' feet. One wrong step, and they would plunge 200 feet into the ocean below. The smaller man grabbed the larger one and pointed to the oil rig's emergency escape sub. He pushed the bearded man in the direction of the steps to their last resort exit. The larger man started up the steps when the hatch on the bright orange sub opened, and a thin-faced woman with her hair in twin Princess Leia buns shouted, "Boys, we have to go now!" The Lampette weapon was silent while the remaining undersea warriors struggled to reset their device. The sailor reached into his blouse and pulled a small pouch that hung from his neck on a string. He emptied the green leafy contents directly into his mouth, chewing and swallowing the pile of vegetable matter. "Bruno, go!" he shouted as he charged at the Lampette gunnery team. Before he crossed the distance between them, the Lampette weapon fired, catching the sailor in white head-on. "Chester!" screamed the woman, who was trying to climb out of the escape sub just as Bruno finished his climb up the damaged metal staircase. "No, Dora!" yelled the big man, forcing her back into the hatchway. Amazingly, Chester was still alive, and still on his feet, his dress whites torn and shredded now hanging from his body. He shook his head as if to clear the ringing impact on his ears, and, slowly at first, then with greater strength and determination, with every step, as the Lampette readied and fired their weapon, again and again. They blasted him 3 times with a weapon that shattered steel with a single blast, and he continued forward, as if undaunted by no more than a stiff wind. The emergency escape sub-klaxon sounded, alerting all that it was powered up and ready for launch. Through the slimy stalks of my living binocular, I watched the nearly naked, except for his boots and underwear, tattooed sailor Chester smash into the Lampette fighters. What this single sailor achieved on the level of one-man violence made Bruce Lee look like a white belt. His first blow, an uppercut, took the lead Lampette fighter's helmet and head clean off, sending it in a trail of pink gore into the waves below. The second Lampette, already charging with his bite-end spear. As its sharpened tip struck the bull sailor's tattooed chest, it bent. The sailor grabbed the bite-end shaft, ripping it from the Lampette warrior. Then, grabbing and crushing the armored gorget protecting the Lampette's throat, he lifted the armored man, slamming him into one of the 2 remaining ocean raiders. The raider toppled over the rampart safety rail and into the water below. The remaining Lampette jammed an armored arm into the superweapon, and its power indicators began to flash red strobes. The limpet had obviously activated some sort of overload process as a suicide mission countermeasure. If it were obvious to me from this distance, with only my Hollywood knowledge of how these things work in Hollywood movies, it had to be deathly obvious to the sailor who stood only feet from his murderer. The sailor, his berserker rage calmed, walked wordlessly to the limpet who was taunting him. He raised his left fist over his head as the escape sub safety release engaged, dropping the powered emergency craft into the water below. The sailor brought his fist down on the raider's armored helmet, cleaving the limpet in two ghastly halves, one that collapsed to the bloody wreckage-strewn deck, the other still held by the forearm and the supergun, and standing like a broken mannequin. The sailor grabbed the bloody mass, and using it like a lateral lever, flung the shredded corpse and attached superweapon off the oil rig, but the superweapon exploded just as it cleared the rig's railing, catching the sailor with the full impact of its blast. Sections of the deep-sea station began to collapse and fall into the ocean. The noise was deafening. I followed Byrne and the other three to the burning wreck, explosions still tearing apart the remaining sections of the rig. Brewitt, the advanced pike rider, pointed to some of the debris. The sailor's body was floating there, one arm still clinging to an emergency flotation device. "He lives!" shouted Brewitt. Impossible, I thought, and I steered my pike to get a closer look. The man was beaten to a pulp. His jaw looked broken, and his right eye was swollen shut. He looked oddly like that old cartoon character, Salty the Sailor. I remember watching those cartoons all day at my granddad's house on Thanksgiving every year, in what seemed like several lifetimes ago. Well, Mr. Indestructible here sure liked his tattoos. His forearms had matching trident tattoos, and his chest had a wild retro piece, a battleship, the USS Illinois, BB-7, 1907. That's a strange tattoo to get, but I was really never into that kind of thing anyway. "We go," declared Byrne, pointing at the horizon. A convoy of 3 vessels was headed in this direction, probably the Navy and the Fleischer Kahn security teams responding to the rig's distress calls. "Come," said Brewitt. Byrne and the 4th man in our scouting party had already dove their pikes beneath the waves. "What about him?" I asked. Brewitt nodded his chin in the direction of the rescue vessels. "Him be fine. Him like you. Givaram." Givaram, I thought. Wasn't that the Mera-Bello term for mighty man?